Welcome back, guys, to Oversimplified Hitler Part 2. If you haven't seen my video on Part 1, go check it out here. I'll leave a little info card. The video will also be in the description. And where we left off is that Hitler has just learned that World War I has been lost by Germany. He is currently in the hospital, being temporarily blinded by mustard gas. And he said that this day was one of the worst days of his life. So how will Hitler sort of pick himself up in a way and eventually rise to become the Chancellor of the German Reich? Let's find out.
Since Germany's military had to be reduced, Hitler could no longer remain a soldier after the war, but he kept working for the army as an informant.
Yes.
After the war, communists in Germany had attempted a revolution, and the government was worried about communism in general. So Hitler was tasked...
So it wasn't even that. The communists actually succeeded. In Bavaria was very briefly known as the Bavarian Socialist Republic. They actually overthrew the government and very briefly, temporarily installed a socialist government in the province, in the Bundesland of, well, now known as the Bundesland, but in the province known as Bavaria, which is southern Germany. Which is where Munich is, which eventually became the sort of headquarters, the main city for the Nazis later in time. So it wasn't that they just attempted a revolution, but they actually briefly succeeded, although it was ultimately brought down by the SPD, which would go on to form the Weimar Republic.
With infiltrating and reporting on any new political parties that could pose a communist threat. A new party called the German Workers' Party threw up a whole bunch of red flags, so Hitler went along to one of their meetings, but found that they weren't communist at all. They were extreme right and shared many of his extreme beliefs, so he left the army and signed up to join the party. His fantastic speaking ability...
Yeah, and he actually lied and said he was something like the 7th member, but in reality he was actually the 55th member. And he might not have, actually, was he even the 55th? I don't know if that's entirely correct. I remember him being something like 200 or something like this. But yeah, he lied later on in the propaganda saying, oh, he was the 7th member or 6th member or something like this. But he's actually much later than that.
He impressed the party's leadership and supporters, and he very quickly rose to the top. He decided...
So it wasn't that he did quickly rise to the top. However, there was this period in the DAP where they were trying to search for a leader, and Hitler said he was merely the drummer of the revolution, der Trommler in German. And he actually wasn't looking to be the leader, because Hitler was not really didn't really have any of these leadership qualities, which is what we learned in the first part as well. But he was a really, really good speaker. He was a really good rabble rouser. He could really get people riled up. And so there was this period of time where they were really looking for that leader, and Hitler was just to sort of be the mouthpiece of the party. And then he eventually rose to leader later on, but the story of this, during this early stages in the party, he was more or less sort of their mouthpiece and less their leader.
The party needed a makeover, so he renamed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short, and he gave it a new color scheme. The Nazis...
And that swastika, he actually, they came up with the logo in something like a day. Like Hitler very briefly sketched it out. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head. And if you guys really want to read more and get really into depth about Hitler's life, I would highly recommend the book Hitler 1896, I want to say. Maybe 1889. I don't remember exactly when he was born, to 1936. Correction. Yes, 1936, by Ian Kershaw, which he really goes into depth. It's probably the best historical record of Hitler's life of this time. But yeah, he just briefly sketched this out, and it was just sort of a haphazard kind of thing. But it was actually designed by Hitler, the Nazi flag.
Weren't very specific on policy, but Hitler made extravagant promises to return Germany to its former glory by undoing the Treaty of Versailles and reuniting all ethnic Germans into one nation. He also said that only pure Aryan people should be allowed to be citizens, and that all Jews would lose their citizenship. These ideas were already common in extreme right politics.
Yeah, and these specific parties, Kershaw gets into a lot of detail on the policies of these parties and how they all sort of interlinked. But eventually the NASDAP would come and sort of succeed really, in a way, all the other far-right parties at the
But
time.
what set the Nazis apart was Hitler himself, and they quickly became the leading party on the extreme right.
Yep.
Many of the political parties in Germany at the time had paramilitary wings, and
yeah.
the Nazis were no different. Hitler set up the very descriptive Whole Protection Detachment, later changed to the very delightful Gymnastic and Sports Division, and finally settling on the ominous Storm Detachment, or SA for short.
Right, and the SA would later to go on and really... there would be immense competition within the party much later, once Hitler rose to power, with the SS, right? And the Night of the Long Knives, which was the sort of, what would you say, the purge, so to say, within the party, was really what took out the SA, because the SA were looking to replace the German army in a manner, right? And the more aristocratic, traditional German officers were really looking to Hitler to sort of take down the SA. And so this sort of all culminated with the assassination of Röhm, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. And he was the leading figure in the SA and one of Hitler's right-hand man. And he was given the option to either commit suicide or be shot. And he was actually shot in his prison cell, bare-chested apparently too. But the SA was a really large figure in the initial rise of Nazism, of this paramilitary force, which is something that we can't even fathom today in Western societies, right? I'm a Canadian. I can't imagine that there's a marauding band of Liberal Party supporters going around and beating up conservatives and crashing their meetings. Like it's ridiculous, right, to even think of this. But they were incredibly brutal and a really useful, resourceful source at the time during these really heightened political tensions within Germany.
Their job was to defend Nazi party meetings and intimidate political opponents.
Yeah.
And they would frequently engage in battles with communists on the streets. Since the Allies had demanded a reduction in Germany's military size, many trained soldiers were left unemployed. They liked the Nazi ideology, and it was only natural for them to join the SA, which grew larger and larger over time.
And the SA was just incredibly violent too. I mean, they were just brutal in their sort of street tactics and intimidation. Just a brutal organization.
The new democratic government that formed after World War I was pretty weak and ineffective. In order to pay reparations to the Allies, it started printing more money. The problem is that printing money doesn't actually give a country more money, it just makes money less valuable. So as the country printed more and more money, it became worth less and less, and the currency crashed. In 1919, one US dollar was worth about 4 German marks. By December 1923, one US dollar was equal to 4.2 trillion marks. The price of bread rose to 200 billion marks. Banknotes became worthless. Unsurprisingly, in such an economic crisis, Germany struggled to pay the Allies. The French were pissed about this, so they occupied the Ruhr, an area full of factories, and took the economic output from the area as payment. They treated the German civilians badly, and in total, approximately 130 Germans were killed during the occupation. Germans were furious, and Hitler and the Nazis thought that now would be a great time to lead a revolution. In November 1923, inspired by something a certain bold Italian man did a year earlier, Hitler stormed a meeting at a beer hall and called for an uprising against the government. With his supporters, he marched on the streets of Munich, hoping the police would join his side. They did not. Hitler...
And fascinatingly, too, during this march, the man to Hitler's left, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but eventually there was a song that was named after him. I don't remember his name just off the top of my head, but he actually caught a bullet that killed him, and some of his blood splashed on the flag, which was known as the Blutfahne, right? The blood flag, which became sort of this holy relic of Nazism and the movement during the time. And the original fighters were actually, they had tombs made in Munich, which the base of this still exists to this day, though the Allies, of course, did blow it up. But the concrete base still exists in Munich to this day. It's just sort of this overgrown thing, but I've seen it, and there's a plaque there. But it's just fascinating to think, like, if that bullet just had went a few centimeters to the right, who knows what would have happened. Maybe that's a what if altist video.
He was put on trial for treason. He could have been sentenced to life, but the right-wing judges thought he was a pretty cool guy. Hitler knew the judges and knew that they would be lenient, so he took the opportunity to make impassioned speeches during the trial. And in the end, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, of which he served 6 months. He only served 9 months, and when I say prison, it was more like a pleasant hotel stay where he had plenty of time to write a book.
Yes.
Yeah,
and I talked about this in the World War II video as well. I think it was the part 1, I want to say, but him really turning this into a propaganda speech and only getting 9 months, sorry, I thought it was 6, really was just such a joke, because I'll just briefly say this because it's in the World War II video. But the Nazi Party almost collapsed during this time while Hitler was in prison. He was unwilling to sort of pick sides. There were people in the north that were trying to gain for leadership. There were people in the south, and it almost led to the complete collapse of the party. And if Hitler had stayed in there for even a year longer, it probably would have been a complete disintegration of the party, and then who knows what would have happened from there. So
affair was covered by the media nationwide, and it made
Yes.
Hitler famous. Hitler and
Absolutely.
his extreme message were now known throughout Germany, but the everyday German still didn't care much for him. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only won about 2% of the vote. Many were still intimidated by all the violence and the shouting and how unpolitician-like he was, but a new economic crisis would change all of that. To help
Yes, the
Germany
Great
pay its
Depression.
reparations, America agreed to give it loans. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash happened, and America wanted its money back. The economic strain this put on an already struggling Germany was severe. Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty was widespread, and Germans were sick of it. It was clear that the newly formed democracy wasn't working. In the face of crisis, Germans began moving to the political extremes. If you were German and wanted change, your choices now were either the communists or the Nazis.
And even between that, some of the party that was really in the middle, the SPD, also had factions within it that wanted to move more right or wanted to move more left. And within the DVP, I want to say, the party that was, Das Zentrum was the other one too, which was the center party, also more right-leaning, more left-leaning. So there was pretty much no, arguably, pretty much no popular centrist position at this time. It was really more left, more right. It was very, very polarized.
Hitler claimed that he was the only one who could return Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party used propaganda to make Hitler seem like a great and powerful man, and they gave the German people a scapegoat to blame for all their suffering. The promise of a single strong dictator was a breath of fresh air for Germans after years of failing democracy. Some bought into his extreme ideology. Some didn't agree with the racism, but were willing to vote for him anyway. Many didn't know much about politics at all, but just got caught up in the hype.
And one of the fascinating things too is that women were actually a large, an arguably large part of the Nazi Party's rise. The sort of middle class, working or family rearing women at the time that really were enthusiastic about these ideas. Again, I don't have it right off the top of my head, but some of the election statistics, not for 1928, but for 1930 and 1933, I believe, it might be 31 or something, really sort of dives into who exactly was voting for Hitler, right? And Kershaw, the book I mentioned, goes into some fascinating letters that he found of people explaining why they were voting for Hitler and, you know, sort of the reasons why they would get into it. Arguably just totally normal people, right? Carpenters, you know, farmers, people owning businesses, regular people, and why they would vote for a party as extreme as the Nazi Party. And I think there's a lot of historical value that can be not only sometimes applied to our modern times, though you have to obviously admit that our times are not the same as 1920s Germany, but can be really looked at in terms of why people vote for and why people support certain extreme ideology.
Election after election, the Nazis became more and more
on the
popular
left and
until
right.
in 1932,
Very important to note
they
that.
became the biggest party in the German parliament. Hitler came to truly believe that he was some sort of great, destined savior of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general Paul von Hindenburg. Since he was now the leader of the biggest party, though, he demanded President Hindenburg make him chancellor. But Hindenburg was reluctant, seeing that Hitler was clearly such a big racist. Industry leaders urged Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship, fearing the rising support for communism. And leader of the Center Party, von Papen, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler, said to Hindenburg, "How about we make Hitler chancellor on the condition that I get to be vice-chancellor and most government jobs go to us moderate conservatives? That way, I'll get to keep my power. I mean, we'll get to keep our power and we'll control Hitler like he's our angry little puppet. What could possibly go wrong?"
Yeah, and that was pretty much a perfect explanation of what happened. It was just, I think there is some famous quote, and I don't remember it off the top of my head, that Papen said that basically said he thinks he made the worst deal of his lifetime. He really made a deal with the devil when he decided to make Hitler chancellor. As it
turned out, everything.
Literally
Hitler became
everything.
Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, but he was not yet a dictator. In February, the German parliament building was set on fire. Historians still aren't sure who did it, and many suspect the Nazis did it themselves, but Hitler blamed the communists, and he convinced President Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree allowing him to imprison all communists and other political opponents. Communists and others were sent off to the first concentration camp in Dachau. At this time, the elderly President Hindenburg passed away, giving Hitler the perfect opportunity. He introduced a law to parliament that would allow him to make all future laws and decisions entirely on his own. With his political opponents imprisoned and the SA intimidating others, Hitler's law passed. Just 2 months after becoming Chancellor, Hitler was now a dictator. He still had one problem. The leader of the SA wanted the SA to take over the job of the regular German army, and the German army didn't like that idea. Hitler needed to maintain the support of his professionally trained German army, more so than his rough and rowdy SA.
Albeit brutal, as I said, brutal people and a lot of former soldiers as well.
So one night in June 1934, he had Röhm and many other of his own SA officers rounded up and murdered. While he was at it, he took the opportunity to brutally settle some personal scores as well. Politicians who had disagreed with him in the past, reporters who had printed negative articles about him, one guy who did absolutely nothing, but they thought he was someone else. In some cases, even their families were murdered. In total, up to 200 people were killed in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. The army, now satisfied that they wouldn't be replaced, pledged total allegiance to their new Führer, and Hitler's control was now absolute. Life in Germany changed violently. Freedom of the press, expression, and public assembly were suspended. Jews were initially branded and their businesses boycotted. And eventually, Hitler would go on to have 6 million Jewish men, women, and children killed in concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced into sterilization for...
And not only that too, but Roma, homosexuals, political opponents, anyone who really opposed the state were murdered in these concentration camps, as well as obviously Jewish men, women, and children.
Physical and mental imperfections. The Hitler Youth became a way to brainwash the young. Boys were trained to fight and returned home from camp violent. Girls were told their purpose was to have many pure Aryan children, and they would sometimes return from camp pregnant. When their parents were understandably horrified, their children would threaten to turn them over to the Gestapo for standing in the way of Germany's greatness. The standard greeting changed, and you could be sent to a concentration camp for not using it. This way, it seemed...
And the army actually managed to keep the salute, the traditional army salute, for a long time until after the bomb plot, which then it was replaced by the Heil Hitler greeting and the arm raising salute.
Like everyone was a Nazi supporter. If you dared oppose Hitler or speak out against him in any way, you also would be sent to a concentration camp. German nationalism captivated the young Adolf. Extreme ideology and anti-Semitism festered in him as a young man living a hard life on the streets. Germany's defeat in the First World War filled him with hatred and a thirst for vengeance. A political movement that treated him like a god, and hundreds of thousands looking up to him as their savior, made him a megalomaniac. And soon, his aggressive foreign policies would drag the world into a second tragic global conflict, otherwise known as...
Perfect ending there. I think he really sold the human tragedy that comes from dictators and comes from warfare that human beings have never seen before, and led to one of the greatest human conflicts of all time. So overall, I think those 2-part videos are really excellent. It really shows you how ideology can really transform you, and how terrible economic conditions and people being in desperate times can lead to totalitarianism. Once again, I would highly recommend the book by Kershaw, as I mentioned before. And just a great job by Oversimplified. There's tons of details that you can really get into. The Reichstag fire is just a fascinating legal chapter of what the government did to act. The SPD, their sort of heroism, their political heroism to try and stop the Nazis from taking over, Papin's political decisions and what was going on with the German elites at the time. It's a really fascinating subject, and I think Oversimplified did a great job covering it. Once again, if you haven't seen my World War II video, I will put a link in the description. Check that out on Oversimplified. And yeah, thank you very much for watching this with me. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.